I count myself pretty lucky to have grown up in the 90s. Not only did I get to experience a great time in PC gaming history, but I got to experience the glory years of the arcade. That's right, that place that had impressive video games, sticky floors, and occasionally sticky controls. I was lucky that where I was living with my parents in the late 90s, I had pretty easy access to a few different arcades. There were some that had a lot of prize redemption machines, pretty much designed to just take your money, and then there were ones that had more arcade game machines, which, were designed to take your money slightly slower. It was a pretty simple formula to make an arcade game, and one that a lot of mobile phone developers seem to have mastered in more modern history. Candy Crush, I'm looking at you. So what makes a good arcade game? Simple. It's got to be easy to pick up, but hard to master, and of course, entertaining. And yeah, a fancy cabinet with bright lighting and good sound certainly doesn't hurt in attracting people to spend their hard cash on said machine. Now, in the 90s, Sega were undisputed kings of the arcade scene, with blockbuster franchises like Virtua Cop, Daytona USA, Sega Rally, and of course, House of the Dead. Now, all of these games were based on Sega's legendary Model 2 arcade system, which was developed in collaboration with GE Aerospace and delivered one of the most powerful arcade systems on the market for the time. Now, I count myself pretty lucky as I actually own an original House of the Dead arcade machine. The machine I own is the Australian version, complete with a giant curtain which shielded any children's eyes from the zombie shooter, although I can't ever remember a time this even being loosely enforced, and I definitely made my way under that curtain as a child myself. Now, while it might seem cool to own a piece of arcade history, and don't get me wrong, it is, keeping a 30-year-old arcade system in working order is a lot like keeping an indoor plant alive, something that I'm not very good at all.
Stop! He's already dead!
And yeah, it's a bit hit and miss, with spare parts not exactly being easily available. That and the fact that it'd be virtually impossible for me to capture footage from means that all of the A-roll you're seeing right now isn't from the 1996 arcade version, but from the 2022 PC remake. Developed by Megapixel and available for virtually all current and past generation platforms, even the beloved Nintendo Switch, which it actually was originally released as an exclusive for, oddly enough.
What a time to be alive.
This remake stays fairly true to the original game, although with a slew of quality of life and modern aiming options, such as using the Switch's Joy-Cons as a faux light gun. There are some enhancements like leaderboards and additional modes in the remake, which I'm not going to cover today, but if you want to find out more about these, then head over to your favourite online store to learn more. Now, there was a PC and Sega Saturn port of the game in 1998, but apart from the fact that I don't have a Saturn and running the Windows 95 game on a modern system is pretty tricky, the games are also reportedly very average ports of the original arcade. So yeah, we're going to be sticking with the 2022 remake here, but I will be mostly speaking about the original arcade experience. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you do enjoy this content, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's grab our trusty handgun, get in our unmarked 90s car, and head back to 1996 to remember House of the Dead. Now, I'll be honest, in modern gaming, I don't generally like on-rails segments, mainly because they tend to ask the player to surrender control to deliver a set piece. And look, it's not the worst mechanic in modern gaming, but certainly not a favourite. So why do I not only tolerate it, but enjoy it in House of the Dead? Well, I think it comes down to the fact that as soon as you start House of the Dead, it establishes itself as more of a visual novel with, lots of shooting, than a more liberal first-person exploration-based shooter. This was developed for the arcade, remember, and it needed to hide its time-based mechanic, which is achieved nicely through this on-rails design. The on-rails nature also gave the developers the ability to create a very curated experience, as they could bank on every player having the exact same game world experience. And while it wasn't the first game to use an on-rails design, I'd argue for the time, it was the best. You've got the trifecta of 90s movie tropes in House of the Dead. Haunted Mansion? Check. Mad Scientist? Check. Secret Agents? Check. It all feels a bit like a movie, and well, I guess I'm not the only one who thought that, because in 2003, we got a movie, which at the time of recording this video is actually ranked the 41st worst movie of all time. Thankfully the game didn't suffer this fate, and whether it's being played on the original arcade machine or the PC re-release, the remake, it's still a lot of fun today. Now, there's no denying that even with the original graphics engine, using a solenoid-equipped light gun is the optimal way to experience House of the Dead. I have a friend who will actually select 2-player on my arcade and use a gun in each hand to blast through the game like he's some type of T-1000. I'm definitely not at that skill level, but for those of you who are, there's definitely that option. Thankfully, with items like the Sinden light gun, you can create a pretty close to perfect light gun experience at home, complete with a solenoid feedback. You know, if you have the spare cash to shell out for the Sinden, which admittedly isn't a cheap piece of hardware. You can obviously get the discount experience using the Nintendo Switch's Joy-Cons. Anyway, back to the game. The overall gameplay loop is pretty straightforward. Shoot zombies, save scientists, and fight the occasional boss. I think one of the things which made the game fun was the over-the-top animations from the enemies when being shot. Despite you starting the game with a handgun, you pretty much blow holes straight through these zombies, only being interrupted by the dreaded reload soundbite. I've been playing House of the Dead on and off for 25 years, and I still forget to reload, but I guess that's why they have the soundbite. Between mowing down enemies with your 6-round handgun, you'll move through various environments which still to this day look impressive. Despite it being marketed as a House of the Dead, there's so many areas to move through, including a whole secret lab complex to mix things up. There's also multiple branching paths which do give the player a sense of choice in an otherwise fairly limited choice game, as well as delivering some replay value. But really, the inherent replay value here is just how fun House of the Dead is, especially on the original arcade hardware. If there's one thing the developers nailed with this game, it's definitely the fun factor. Now, while the game is absolutely fun, being an arcade game, there is an element of frustration, mainly around cheap hits by the enemies. There are some sections of the game that are virtually impossible to avoid taking damage, especially in the boss fights. And look, you know, I get it. Lost lives equal more coins being put in the machine, and that's how arcade works. But despite the flawless logic of this mechanic, I'm still going to be frustrated by it. Weapon-wise, outside of some unlockables for the re-release, you'll be venturing through the game equipped with a handgun which, frustratingly, holds just 6 bullets at a time, which makes your shot choice when dealing with multiple adversaries pretty important. Thankfully, the reload mechanic is pretty much instantaneous, taking about a second. But in a game as fast-paced as House of the Dead, the time to reload and reacquire a target from a light gun can take another second or two, necessitating you to know which enemies to deal with first before taking damage. As well as damaging enemies, your handgun can also break open certain environmental elements, as well as shoot down projectiles thrown at you by some of the enemies, which is pretty cool, but eats into that precious ammo clip pretty damn fast too. The same goes for the game's many bosses, which you literally need to squeeze the trigger until you get carpal tunnel syndrome, before you can actually put these enemies down. But yeah, I guess that's the point after all. Now, when you first hear and see the House of the Dead arcade machine, you assume you're going to be traversing through a house, which is true, although I'd argue it's more like a castle. But I guess Castle of the Dead didn't exactly have the same ring to it. But anyway, this house, castle, mansion, or whatever you want to call it, includes not only your typical house environment, but also an entire secret base beneath it. A bit like another horror-based game released 6 months earlier. It's hard to critique pacing in an on-rails shooter, but to me at least the difficulty curve does deliver a little bit of respite for new and returning players. The first chapter is pretty much a tutorial. While it is possible to take damage and indeed die completely, the enemies are slow moving and anyone with a reasonable aim shouldn't have too many problems. As you progress through the game, you uncover new enemy mechanics, like projectiles being thrown at you, and then the enemies rushing and jumping at you, or even worse, projectile throwing enemies then jumping at you. And look, if this was a regular home PC or console FPS, I'd criticise this heavily, but we need to look at this objectively as an arcade game. Just like you couldn't exactly put Duke Nukem 3D in an arcade and, expect the average punter to know what they were doing with its many mechanics, you can't really criticise the skill level requirement from a much more approachable game like House of the Dead. Graphically, as well as a pretty unique art style with lots of polygons for the time, I think the most impactful thing which contributed to the experience from a graphical perspective was the 60 frames per second frame rate. Now, I acknowledge I might be in the minority here, but I'll always favour a higher and more consistent frame rate over higher fidelity. How we had 60 frames per second experiences in 1996, and over 25 years later, we are still giving developers a free pass on 30 FPS titles, absolutely boggles me. Now, I will point out that in the remake, You are getting 60 FPS on most platforms, excluding the Switch, which, given its portable nature and battery life, I'm going to go ahead and give a free pass on this occasion. The remake also uses the Unity engine, and from all of my testing, I never encountered any crashes or issues on the PC version. As always though, your mileage may vary. Sound-wise, House of the Dead was an absolute masterclass, helped in no part from the large booming speakers on the arcade cabinet. The soundtrack here is iconic, and it's one of those soundtracks that you can hear and know exactly what it's from. It's hard to describe it. I'd say it's like a mix between church music and rock music. And yeah, look, I realise that isn't very descriptive, but yeah, just trust me on this one. It's really good. Voice acting is appropriately cheesy, but that's really part of the game's charm. House of the Dead doesn't always take itself so seriously. This is both entertaining and endearing. Sound effects wise, you're also getting a great experience with very satisfying bullet sounds as you unload your handgun into somewhat endless hordes of zombies, as well as the sounds of the zombies and creatures coming to zero you. Now, like the graphics, there are some changes here in the remake. Most notably, the original soundtrack is gone and replaced by a new soundtrack, no doubt due to licensing issues. The new soundtrack is alright, I guess. It seems to have got a pass mark from the gaming press, but for me the original soundtrack was a huge part of House of the Dead, and its absence is probably the biggest criticism I can level at the remake. It kind of goes without saying by now, but the arcade was one of the places I spent a lot of my free time growing up, and I have some cracker memories of it. House of the Dead was one of those machines in the arcade that always had a lineup to play, and there was the subtle art of playing another machine you didn't really want to play, while you kept an eye out for the game you wanted to play to become free. House of the Dead, the arcade game, definitely earns a place in my gaming arcade top 10. It was a technologically cutting-edge game, presented with the amount of polish that only Sega could deliver. The 2022 remake is an okay game. It's certainly not a bad game, but unless you're interested in unlockables and leaderboards, there's really no reason to return to it after you've experienced it, which for the current asking price and length is a pretty tall ask. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.